And our final speaker, Dr. John Tures, is that right? Is a professor of political science and the coordinator of the political science program at LaGrange College. And his talk is the interesting title, Want to Win the World Cup? Then Embrace Freedom and Democracy. Please join me in offering a collective welcome to our speakers.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Tures. I'm from LaGrange College, which is an hour outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And before you look at the topic and say, how is this related to anything else at the conference? I will be able to connect it with a lot of papers that have been delivered today. So I will go ahead and move along. Let's see, or I will attempt to. Okay. There we go, down. Just to let you know, if you ever watched the American show Big Bang Theory, there was a physics conference, and Penny, who's a waitress, attends, and she says, oh, it's terrible, there are only 20 people here. And one of the physicists said, 20 people, that's like Woodstock at a physics conference. And so I'm just looking, when I look out among everyone, I say, oh, this must be so much bigger than Woodstock. Look at all the attendees. I normally have about 10 people in the audience when I give presentations. So at any rate, I will go on and talk about sport as used by authoritarians in athletics. You've seen it also used in an ideological battle to justify the regime. We think of the Cold War and the United States and its Western allies against the Soviet Union and its allies being used. Now, the new Olympic rivalry is the United States and its friends versus China. And certainly in the Winter Olympics and Vladimir Putin and his Russian team and how they attempt to manipulate the results perhaps, or the athletes themselves. But we've also seen sports as a distraction from domestic turmoil. As Ori told you about what was going on in Nazi Germany during its time, I visited the site of the 1936 Olympics, which was an attempt to justify Nazi ideology and white supremacism and the role that Jesse Owens did in busting the myth, so to speak. But many of you, I don't know if you know that in 1934, Benito Mussolini did the same when Italy hosted the World Cup. And he did everything he could to get Italy to win that, including intimidating other teams, questionable calls. It was all to justify his regime and even his abuses to go forward. For Argentina in 1978, the dictator of the country, the leader of the military junta, was not even a big fan of soccer, Rafael Videla. But at any rate, he understood how soccer could be used to justify the repression, the disappearances, and all the deaths. I first became aware of this when I was in college. We got to meet a woman who was tortured during his regime. So that's the connection to Vanya's work. I will move on ahead. For this analysis, to see if there's a connection between a country's level of freedom and how well they perform at the World Cup, the FIFA football. I use Freedom House data. Many of you may know that. Just to quickly summarize, they have a trichotomous categorization of free, partly free, and not free. They look at civil liberties and political rights. I will also look at a second database, which is called Polity, which goes much further back. It is an institutional measure of democracy. So institutionalism is linked to Fevzi's paper, where they look at how much power is dispersed throughout the system, whether it is concentrated in the hands of a few or spread out through many. So one based on human rights, one based on institutions and structures. As you can see, many of the winners of the World Cup, they all tend to be from a similar neighborhood. Either they're in the Eastern, South America, or they're from West Europe predominantly. So I'm going to look at not only 1930 through 2022, the World Cup winners and the runners-up, but I will also look at who qualified in 2022, who was able to make it to the tournament, who broke through based on undergraduate research, and then the 2002 case of Turkey, which, by the way, I apologize. My sister told me you were spelling it wrong, but I haven't had a chance to change that. So. Just to let you know, it's a lot of words up there, but I will summarize the work that my undergraduate students and I did on the 2022 World Cup. that you got to see that only 4 countries who qualified out of the 32 were listed as not free, including one of the hosts, who I'm told, according to rules, automatically gets in. You had, let's see, I think there were 5 countries that were partly free. The other 23 were fully free countries who qualified. Well, if you want to get to the second round, evidently only half these teams go on to what's known as the knockout round, which is like the playoffs of the World Cup. There we had 14 of the 16 finalists were free countries, and only 2 were partly free, and those were Morocco and Senegal. Going back through, since Freedom House started collecting data in 1972, we have from 1974 through 2022, we have had 90% of the World Cup winners and runners-up have been free. We have Brazil under 2 periods of partly free. We only have 1 authoritarian winner, and that was Argentina in 1978. And I've read stories about how Argentina, they may have manipulated the results against Peru and possibly against the Dutch. They made sure that they won this game in overtime. So that's almost 90% of the countries who've either won or finished second have been free countries. But I know some of you are thinking, the World Cup is much older than 1972. What about the 1930s? It started in 1930. This we have to use polity, which goes back to 1800. And so in using that data, we have found that early on, there were a number of countries that were partly free and free. I have their regime scores. These are not soccer scores. We don't have Hungary having 7 own goals, although that would be impressive. Sorry if there are any Hungarians here. I was just joking at your expense. But early on, you saw that authoritarians were able to get most of the early winners, but that changed about the 1960s, especially our German friends over here, can attest to. And sure enough, by the same measures, over 70% of the winners and runners-up have been fully free. We're not talking partly free, fully free. The rest of them have been anocracies, which is like a partly free, or they have been authoritarians. So I know, is this anecdotal? Is it correlation, not causation? It's very hard to argue with these results, that these are just mere coincidence. My sister-in-law is a big fan. She's also a physicist, which is why we watch Big Bang Theory, for those who've seen it. And she was looking at my research after we watched an episode, and she said, what about the women? So we have research from the women in World Cup. Women's World Cup began in 1991. And so if you look at the top 4 finishers, first, second, third, fourth, 32 countries since 1991 who have finished in the top 4. And yes, Germany is in there too. You see 30 of them are free countries. The only one who was able to get into the top 4 was China. In the iconic game in 1999, where the United States played them, and then earlier in 1995. Let us talk about Turkey. Turkey, anybody watch the 2022 World Cup this year?
Yeah.
Okay, that was a huge party for Atlanta. I met somebody who drove 6 hours to go to the watch party for the World Cup, which was quite impressive. By the way, my hometown of LaGrange, Georgia, you may not have heard it, but they provided the turf, the field for the World Cup, which I was told was much better than the Super Bowl turf, which they said, the players said the ground felt sweaty. So I thought maybe LaGrange can help out Phoenix. But at any rate, yeah, Turkey was the Morocco of 2002. The Cinderella team. It was the first time they had ever qualified since 1954 for a World Cup, and they took great advantage of this opportunity. And by the way, 2002 was also one of the best years for Turkey in the Freedom House measures. They were still listed as partly free, but it was one of the freest times since the 1980 coup. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Turkey in this tournament, they lost to Brazil. They tied Costa Rica. They defeated China by enough goals that they qualified over Costa Rica. And in the playoffs, they defeated the host Japan. Then they defeated Senegal in a big upset and made it to the Final Four, where they lost to eventual champion Brazil, only 1-0, or 1-0 as they like to say in some places. But in the third place, they faced the other host, South Korea, the joint hosts, where they defeated them for a third place finish. Very impressive for Turkey, for a team that had not gone so long. It's probably one of the biggest World Cup stories. Unfortunately, Turkey has never made it back to a World Cup. Around this same time, there's something called UEFA, which I don't quite understand because I'm American, but my son watches UEFA and he knows more about it. And Galatasaray, it's like a tournament of all the professional teams. Galatasaray, I am told, has won twice. Do I have that right? I think Galatasaray, defeating Real Madrid and Arsenal, which is a very big deal for Galatasaray at the UEFA, but they have not won since this time either. Could it be an accident? We also know that in the case of Turkey, the leader, Erdogan, has also been targeting members of the Hizmet members who play, especially those from Galatasaray. And during the same time, they've also, Turkey has also declined in freedom. Of course, Freedom House since 2017 has listed them as not free. The regime has purged several athletes, and I will not get through all the names. I think some names have been mentioned. Elise and Julia talked about people who are refugees. Some of them are refugees in other countries, including the United States, where it is very difficult for them. We're talking about basic human rights, like what Ayan was talking about earlier. And so finally, I think with all of these numbers, let's not forget what Reginald was saying. Through research, we can find truth. Some concluding thoughts. Erdogan may have killed the Galatasaray goose that has laid the golden eggs. This was a great opportunity for Turkey, and Turkey is not the same as they were in 2002. His authoritarian actions seem to be bad for athletics. When dictators who are not soccer stars themselves start picking who are the good ones or bad or something, there comes problems. Authoritarians will still attempt to manipulate sports to justify their regimes or to distract people, in my conclusion, an attempt to enhance their legitimacy. But it tends to fail because athletics succeed best when the players, the coaches, and yes, these are fans at a Galatasaray match where they put up a message and they also had the image of Rocky from the movies, the 1970s, 80s movies. And Erdogan immediately launched an investigation of these fans as well. They do their best when players, coaches, and fans have the freedom to act the way they would like to act without government direction. And my last quick story, the East German skating champion, Katharina Witt, who won 2 gold medals in the 1980s. Stasi, the East German secret police, had a file on her of 3,500 pages. And she wasn't even that old. I mean, I keep wondering, what could you do during this time? But they were spying very heavily on their best star. So I will yield the balance of my time for any questions you might have. Thank you.